friendly in that they're growing. When the current President, Ranil Wickremesinghe, visited New Zealand in 2016 as Sri Lanka's Prime Minister, our two governments announced that we would be opening high commissions in each other's countries, and that was a recognition or an affirmation of the fact that our two governments wanted to do more together and wanted our countries to build our bilateral relations, which have been warm for a very long time, ever since Sri Lanka gained independence, and we've been working together closely since then, but we wanted to invest more in the relationship after all of those decades to try and get more out of it and try and deliver more value for New Zealanders and Sri Lankans. Well, on the trade side, I think for a long time, since the 1970s, that New Zealand has been exporting large quantities of milk powder to Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka has been in return exporting significant amounts of tea and rubber to New Zealand. The Anchor and Dilmah brand names are very well known in our respective countries. There's also, so that's on the trade side, there's also in terms of services, I guess a growing trade in education services. So our education institutions are working more closely together, aimed to build the links between our universities, but also to help more Sri Lankans to study at the tertiary level in New Zealand. Those cooperation arrangements include the idea that a Sri Lankan might do the first half of their degree in Sri Lanka, and then with a Sri Lankan institution then travel to New Zealand to finish off their degree there. So there are those education links, and also on the services side, I guess tourism is a big part of the relationship too. More and more Sri Lankans are travelling to New Zealand and vice versa as tourism destinations. But in terms of other elements of economic cooperation, one strong area, I guess, is in agriculture. New Zealand's dairy industry is one of the most successful and productive in the world, and over the past decade we have been working with Sri Lankan authorities and other Sri Lankan institutions to try to help Sri Lanka build up its dairy industry. So that's in the sorts of areas like training for farmers, so extension services for farmers, but also delivering rural livelihoods to people from vulnerable communities in the north. So agriculture is another area where we have been focusing on significantly as well. I think there's significant potential. I think one issue has been this, traditional reliance on this small group of products. So in New Zealand's case, milk powder to Sri Lanka, and in Sri Lanka's case, tea and rubber to New Zealand. And I think that one of the primary objectives of the New Zealand High Commission in Colombo, which is now about 18 months old, is to try to build up and diversify that trade portfolio. And there are a broad range of things. Some of those will be in the primary industries or the food and beverage sectors, because New Zealand makes a broad range of such products which we export to the world. And having lived here now for 18 months, I can attest that many of them would find a good place in the Sri Lankan market. And I know that it's true as well that there are a broad range of Sri Lankan companies that are keen to do more in New Zealand. Some of that is in the sort of IT space, IT services space, but there will be a broad range of opportunities there. I think one, very obvious challenge in terms of encouraging New Zealand companies to operate and invest more in Sri Lanka is the country's economic crisis and the sort of the images that were beamed around the world about Sri Lanka back in May, June, July, which gave a certain impression of the country. But part of our job as the High Commission is to send back messages about the economic recovery that the people of Sri Lanka and the institutions and government of Sri Lanka are working towards, and also to convey the idea that there are efforts here to rebuild the economy that New Zealand companies can be part of. Well, I guess I should start by saying that New Zealand, for most of its history, was populated entirely by what we call our tangata whenua, the Māori people, the first people of New Zealand, our indigenous people. And as a result, the Māori language, te reo Māori as it is known, was the only language widely spoken in New Zealand. That was true for most of our history. But then when colonisation began in large numbers, European colonisation began, and a British government was installed in New Zealand. Various actions by the government, by authorities, by society led to a suppression of the Māori language, and it was greatly damaged by that. And when I say actions to suppress the Māori language, that included things like rules in schools about only being able to speak English, there being sanctions for the speaking of Māori, there being no government funds for the promotion of the education of te reo Māori. So that led over a period of time, I guess, starting around the middle of the 19th century to around the middle of the 20th century, where the Māori language went from being the predominant language spoken in New Zealand to a language that was in real danger. And the Māori language petition, which, as you correctly note, is just experiencing its 50th anniversary this year, it was a recognition by a broad range of organisations who cared about the Māori language that it was incumbent on the New Zealand government, but New Zealand society as a whole, to really invest in this treasure, this taonga, to use the te reo Māori word, so that it would live on and it would be vibrant. And so that petition was handed to Parliament in 1972. We're 50 years on from that now, and I think that there have been ways in which there has been a significant renaissance in the Māori language. I mean, I'll give you a few examples of that. One is that, and Sri Lankans will know about this because many Sri Lankans watch the New Zealand cricket team or the New Zealand rugby team play against Sri Lanka or other teams, that when the New Zealand national anthem is sung, it is now sung first in te reo Māori and then in English. That's something that's happened during my lifetime. That started in the 1990s, but that is sort of a symptom of the general societal trend that was the result of government action, societal action, grassroots action, to try to place te reo Māori at the very centre of New Zealand society, and that there was an expectation that all elements of government, all elements of culture, all elements of what it means to be a New Zealander would include this foundational element of the tangata whenua, the founding, the first people of New Zealand. And I guess language is a very important part of that, but it's only one part of that. There have been many ways in which the New Zealand government, New Zealand society, has aimed to try to redress the loss of power, the loss of wealth, the loss of status and prestige that the Māori people suffered as a result of colonisation. And that has certainly been a significant part of what the New Zealand government has been working towards over the 50 years since that petition was lodged in Parliament. Sure. I mean, I think many countries sort of have a particular date when they went from being not independent to being independent. With New Zealand, it's a little bit more complicated than that because, New Zealand's, as I mentioned earlier, British government that was installed in the 1850s in New Zealand and endured, it governed over a significant settler population that was itself British. And so the sort of disentangling of New Zealand institutions from British ones is a sort of different proposition than a country that has simply been, externally colonised. And we went through many stages of that sort of gaining independence from the United Kingdom. I guess the first stage of that was in the 1850s when New Zealanders started voting in parliamentary elections, although I should say male New Zealanders started voting in parliamentary elections. It was a couple of decades later that Māori men were able to vote, and then it was in the 1890s where women were able to vote. So I guess it's from the 1890s that New Zealand has had a universal suffrage. And from the beginning, so that second half of the 19th century, New Zealand has had meaningful independence in the sense that we have had a parliament that has been passing laws about how New Zealand should be governed. However, there were significant restrictions on that, and there were significant ways in which the British government, that London, retained some form of power or sovereignty over New Zealand. And so, in a gradual way, decade by decade, extra powers were gained by New Zealand. So in the 1920s, New Zealand started to negotiate its own trade treaties, for example. In the 1930s, with the emergence of our first Labour government, and in the period of the two world wars, New Zealand de facto started to develop its own foreign policy. And then I think 1947, which is the 75th anniversary that you were talking about, we passed legislation, or two major pieces of legislation, which essentially made abundantly clear in legal terms that our Parliament had full legal and constitutional powers over both what happened in New Zealand and also our conduct of foreign policy. And so many New Zealand historians would date that date, 1947, which is 75 years ago this year, to the moment when New Zealand gained full independence, although, as I've explained, I think there was a long period, probably almost a century before then, where we had varying degrees of independence. But, you know, this process of gaining full and complete power over our affairs and our foreign affairs, it continues. I mean, it was not until 2004, as an example, that New Zealand gained a Supreme Court and cut off its final links to the British court system. So prior to 2004, if you were charged with a crime in New Zealand, the final appeal that you could make was to the Privy Council in the UK. Now we have a fully autonomous legal system, and we remain, and this was made clear to New Zealanders and the world with the sad passing of the Queen, we retain constitutional connections to the British Crown, which obviously Sri Lanka doesn't retain, and most countries in the Commonwealth don't retain. That is to say that that the King Charles, is our head of state, although his powers are exercised by his representative in New Zealand, who is the Governor-General appointed by the New Zealand Prime Minister. So those connections with the British system remain, but far, far less than obviously they were 75 years ago when we gained our full independence, as I described. Well, at the moment, a great focus of us and of mine and the High Commission is, Sri Lanka is going through this very significant economic crisis and related, political and social issues, and we are very focused on how can New Zealand help Sri Lanka through this very difficult situation during this hour of need. And, a conclusion that we've come to is that there are a broad range of things that Sri Lanka is trying to do at the moment in the reform area, reforming different areas of policy where we, New Zealand, might be able to help via expertise. So we have, over the last generation or two, been through economic crises which have led to major policy changes, and that means that there are a broad range of New Zealanders with expertise in the kinds of policy reform that Sri Lanka is currently considering. And so what we want to do is just make sure that in those areas where we can be helpful, that the Sri Lankan government is keen for us to be helpful, we can. So one example of this is that one of our experts who used to lead the New Zealand Reserve Bank has been spending time in the Sri Lankan Central Bank and helping the governor with various reform work that he has underway. But we hope to develop other areas. And I think as you look forward, though, as Sri Lanka hopefully moves from this crisis into a phase of recovery and then renewal, I obviously hope that New Zealand can be part of that, whether it be our companies, our investors, our government. We want to sort of be part of that in a way that's mutually beneficial for our countries. So that's very much our focus. But obviously, events have changed a lot. The environment has changed a lot in Sri Lanka in the last year, and we'll just have to see where things get to in the period ahead.